once again. I'm here just to give you a few simple little tricks that might make life with Fusion an awful lot easier. Have you ever found that your floor plans do look a little bit complicated? Perhaps there are too many lines? Well, one of the choices you could make is if you click between the tram lines of a wall, just like that, it's been highlighted. And if I were then to hold down the Shift key and click on a second thicker wall, the thicker walls are being increased over the other internal walls to indicate one of two things. One, they are an external wall, and secondly, that when I come to tile this kitchen, the tiles can be laid in the window sill. So, extra thick walls. What else can I do with those walls, I wonder? Well, if I were to come up to the Items tab, in here, just into this area that I'm pointing, there is a choice of wall types, and perhaps I might want to choose cross-hatching. And what that will do now is cross-hatch both walls. So when they're deselected, that's left-clicking anywhere, and I then hold down the Shift key, so that when I hold down the Shift key on wall 1 and the second, go back up to wall types and choose to have a single hatch. There you can see a more distinctive floor plan is both clearly now indicating a thicker or an external wall and an internal wall again. Perhaps there is a third choice, and if you were to perhaps have a stud wall on your design, and that's just thickening up the walls and changing the fill color of that object. Have you also noticed that occasionally as you're moving around the drawing, here I have a floor, it's indicated by the red line all the way around. In fact, I've chosen to put a box on that floor. See our other masterclasses, and I've changed that box to be translucent glass, and that gives a very shiny reflective floor. And I can show you and prove to you that that's the case. The height of the box is 1 mil, and the height off the floor is 3 millimeters. Have you ever noticed that moving around your designs that quite often we can accidentally click on one or many objects, and perhaps I've chosen that worktop and this worktop down here, and I can accidentally move them when you're trying to do something, selecting, not quite getting there. But here is a magic button. It's called the lock, and at the moment you can see it's simply locked is raised. When I push it down, those items now are fully locked into place. They cannot be moved or dragged. You can see whatever I try to do, those items cannot be moved. They're locked in place. And that lock, click on any one of the topics and you can lift the lock, and those then can be moved. Well, if for instance you wanted to lock the whole design, if you hold down the Control A, they all become selected. Simply click them with the lock and then click anywhere else, and they no longer can be moved. Everything is locked in place. Want to go back to it and unlock it, click on any part of that, the lock becomes highlighted, lift it up, and now deselect, and away I can go with those items being moved. You can see that's the accident. It's warning me obviously that things are clashing, and the only way to acknowledge any of this is to go back up to the undo button and undo until you're correct again. Control A, selecting everything, lock, deselect, nothing can be moved now that's within that group of items that have been selected. Well, let's have a look at a couple of other things. There are a pair of lights in here. They're part of the lock, so I'm going to lift them up. Have you ever noticed that they're really quite difficult to get in line? Well, again, there is this option to put on a grid, and this is the grid. It's lying on the viewing tab. So if I turn on the grid, and you can see they're not quite in line. Well, I can even make that grid any size I want it to be, any size at all, simply by changing that figure in there. And secondly, over on the Home tab, there is an area here called snapping, and it's set by default to snap to a wall and snap to another item. But I can also choose to snap to a grid, so that when you start to move these objects, because they're paired, they are now movable. I've moved them, but they're not in line. So all I've got to do is deselect them, choose that one, and move it back. Can you see it snapping to the grid selection? There they are, a perfect pair. They're in alignment. Select them by lassoing the pair, perhaps moving my cursor down to another area. Here's another trick. If I hold down the control key and tap D, it duplicates. Now all I've got to do is to move them to an area that's snapping to the grid. So anywhere and everywhere. I can reckon now 1, 2, 3, fourth grid. So 1, 2, 3 and fourth. Put my cursor, that's holding down the mouse button in the middle of your mouse, and it will then move your cursor. Control D again, and there are a pair exactly where I would want them to be. Once I've finished using the grid in any shape and form, I can go back to view, I can then turn it off, and there we have a perfectly set aligned ceiling lights, for instance. What else can we do? Well, there's a lot we can actually choose to do. If you would notice, my sink is not directly in front of my window. The sink is locked. Now when I come and select the sink, I can drag it anywhere because I've unlocked it. Well, I'm never quite going to get it because it's snapping, so you might choose then to go up to the Home tab and look for snapping. It's saying I'm snapping to a wall, snapping to a grid, or snapping to another item. Well, snapping to another item now means that it's a little bit freer. I could then come back and say, well, snapping, don't snap to a wall. And do you know what? Don't even bother snapping to a grid. So you then think, right, it's completely free. Well, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But all this coming in and snapping and unsnapping, those are the two defaults. They're okay, but there is a way of breaking the snapping rule, and that's simply by holding down the Shift key. And then when you do that, you can actually move that. Once moved, I'm now moving it, but if I hold down the Shift key, it no longer snaps. It's free to move around. So Shift breaks that rule. The tap, you'll notice, is locked. Do you see that? So I'm going to unlock the tap. I can then move that tap anywhere I want it to be. If I want it a little bit freer, I can use again the Shift key. Further, and I know this is a silly example, but I can actually rotate that tap in any position I want to do. Again, I'm going to get the clashing item coming on. It's saying it's clashing. So let's just ignore the tap for one moment because I want to show you a great tool. Let's put the sink. There's the sink. I'm selecting it. I'm saying to it LSX651, move it anywhere in a ridiculous position. There it is. The tap stayed where it was because it was a separate tap. But I want to, in a moment, centralize that sink with the window. Now here we go. I need to select a reference point for that sink right now. So if I hold down the Shift key again and lasso the sink and the window, there is that tool just there. Says center an item on a selection. And hey ho, there is my sink exactly in the middle of the window. Take some advice and deselect them before you go and choose to select the sink again. And here's another tip for you. If you hold down the control key and then tap your left hand keyboard arrow, it suggests that it could come off the wall by 60mm. Halve that. Let's make it 30. And there it is in a central position. Now, why did the tap not move? Simple. It was not part of the sink. It wasn't attached originally to the sink. So I'm going to deselect. I'm going to right click and set the tap. It's a bezel tap. I can then start to move it around. I can hold down the shift key. It's completely free to come with me. Or I can go back up to rotation and put it in any angle that I want it to be. I could make it a little bit freer. You can see it snapping again. Hold down the shift key and it becomes free, completely free. Or I could have held that tap and selected the window. So there's the window and the tap. I could then say centralize it. And there it is. All it needs to do is to bring it off the wall, but first don't forget to deselect. They are paired, they're twinned. So I just got to go back to the tap and choose then control and perhaps forward, and it's offering me 30. I'm going to give it halfway, that's 15mm, and there it is off the wall very nicely.